Okay, Elias, hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And how are you?
I'm good, actually. I'm just a little bit tired, but anyway, I'm really excited about today's topic because it
Mm-hmm.
it looks
Because
it looks very interesting, actually.
so today's topic of our video is fairy tales are bad for children or good. So I think I'm going to propose my position, and my position is that fairy tales are actually good for children. And I think that because of the fact that what are the fairy tales basically? The fairy tales are the some poems, or it is some just basically information texts and about some magical creatures. Usually it's magical creatures with some kind of magical skills, and usually happens in some fantasy world with random different creatures with maybe they look like maybe they look like some animals or people, or maybe some fantasy creatures like elves or other creatures, and they often they often are for children, and there are a lot of like examples of those kind of fairy tales. For example, Peter Pan, or maybe like the Winnie Pooh or something like that. If we take the Russian fairy tales, maybe like Dimovichka or Buratina or something like that. And often they're read for the children because they have a lot of interesting creatures, a lot of interesting characters. And I think when parents read those for children, they are making good for their children. And I recommend every parent to read fairy tales for children. And I think that's because of the fact that those fairy tales can improve and enhance the creativity of the children, because of the fact that when you read a lot of fairy tales for your children, while listening, they imagine a lot of different creatures, and they imagine a lot of different worlds. And we know that in a real world, we don't have like different creatures with a lot of different magical skills, but we have that in the fairy tales. And the worlds in those fairy tales really vary from one to the second fairy tale. For example, in one of the worlds, the main character can be on a big planet with different magical creatures, like, and they oh, and they can look like a real world, a real world animals, and that can really improve the creativity of the children. And also, the fairy tales can teach children to understand our real world better, because often those fairy tales are written on the basis of a real world. As I said before, there there are often animals and creatures based on a real world creatures, because of the fact that the human brain is just limited to the world and view of of his own, and we cannot imagine something outside of our worldview, and that can really that can really help children to understand the world better, and how the different creatures and even people like communicate with each other, and how they interact with each other. And often fairy tales are written to teach children something, to something good. And I think instead of like watching TikToks, Instagram, or YouTube, it's better children to watch fairy tales, read fairy tales, or listen to fairy tales. That was my position, Ilyas. So thank you for listening. And now I'm giving my word to Ilyas.
Thank you for presenting your opinion on this kind of debatable issue. And I will present you arguments against the reading the fairy tales for kids. So it is shown that many fairy tales show some traditional roles for man and a woman. For example, women are often shown as needed to be some saved, and the men are some, very brave heroes. For example, in Cinderella or the Snow White, female characters wait for the prince to rescue them, and this can teach children that girls should be passive and the boys should be brave and the more active than the women. But the studies have shown that exposure to the some traditional gender roles in media can shape children's perception of gender. For example, a study by Geneva Davis Institute in Gender in Media found that the male characters in children's media outnumber female characters nearly from 3 to 1 and often reinforcing gender stereotypes. Another argument about the considering that the fairy tales are bad for kids, that the classic fairy tales often contain some violent senses that can be frightened for some young children, potentially leading to some nightmares or increase some anxiety. For example, in the Hansel and Gretel involves children being abandoned in the forest and encounter cannibalistic witch. And Little Riding Hood features a wolf who eats the grandmother. Also, we have the Russian version, the Nu Pogodi, where the wolf trying to eat the rabbit, and while he is, while he is moving on the street, for example, he's he's smoking, doing some unacceptable things. I know that's just a cartoon, but anyway, probably this cartoon would was based on the fairy tales about the wolf who wanted to eat the grandmother. For example, the classic fairy tales, as I said before, that the research indicate that the exposure to violent content can increase anxiety and the fear of children. For example, the American Academy of the Pediatrics reports that media violence can contribute to aggressive behavior and some fear to real life of the violence. And my last argument would be about the some unrealistic expectation. The fairy tales often conclude with some happily and ever after, which isn't always reflective to our real life. And this can create some unrealistic expectation about life and some relationships between people. For example, the one of the popular fairy tales like Cinderella with some glass slipper, suggesting that life always has a need and, you know, happy resolution. And some survey that conducted in the UK by National Literacy Trust found that 71% of parents believe that the fairy tales are important for teaching children about good and bad. But 39% of parents also worry that fairy tales create some unrealistic expectation about life. It's almost 50%. It's almost the half of the whole population of the UK. No, like not the whole population, I mean, but it's a lot of people. So yeah, that was my last argument. Thank you for listening to me. That was a pleasure to provide you the arguments against the considering the fairy tales good for kids. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank
Have
you, Ilyas.
we have some
I
further
think
questions?
I think we have a time, and then thank you for the conversation and goodbye.
Okay, thank you.